When I opened my laptop to get all the birthday love from my Facebook friends, I noticed that my account wasn't the one on the screen. It was Amy's. And like every red-blooded male, I decided to do some snooping around, and what I saw made me absolutely sick to my stomach. It made me wish I'd never looked. Back in the fall of 2008, I enrolled in paralegal school at a small community college in North Carolina. I was looking for direction in my life and had always been intrigued by the law. And because at the time I had neither the money nor the discipline to go to law school, I did what I thought was the next best alternative. One of the unexpected perks of being at a community college in a female-dominated field was the guy-to-girl ratio. That semester, I was just one of 4 men enrolled in the paralegal program. There were just over 60 women enrolled, which meant that for every 1 guy, there were over 15 girls. And what's more is that the vast majority of our female classmates were in their early 20s. A lot of them had just graduated from high school. And because of this, that first semester was one to remember. Even though this was a small community college, there were still plenty of off-campus parties on weekends, and those parties facilitated a lot of hookups. As much fun as it was hooking up with our female classmates, it did lead to a lot of unnecessary drama. And as you can probably imagine, things could get pretty messy between classmates. I may or may not have been involved in some of these myself. If I'm being honest, it was almost like being in high school all over again. But I digress. So the second semester rolls around and my first class is Civil Lit. After I took my seat, I caught the eye of a pretty girl who walked in and took her seat right in front of me. She had dirty blonde hair and blue eyes. She was wearing these super tight jeans and a shirt she had obviously cut to make sure everyone saw her navel piercing. This girl was what I would describe as nasty hot. Pretty enough to catch your eye, but dresses in such a way that says she gets around. Now, I was only 31 at the time and didn't have much experience with women. I had only been divorced for over a year, and because I didn't get raked over the coals, I was still as naive about women as I ever was. So I had no idea at the time that she was the type of girl I should have steered clear of. Her name was Amy, and she was the most beautiful disaster I had ever laid my eyes on. Her deep southern twang and her friendly legs were more than enough to draw me in. Well, it appeared that the feeling was mutual, because we started flirting with each other right away and did so on a regular basis. In my mind, it was only a matter of time before we hooked up. At the end of the week, our instructor gave us a pop quiz on the week's lessons, and the test was old school SAT style. You know, the ones where you have to fill in the bubbles? Well, I didn't have a pencil, so I tapped Blondie's shoulder and said, "Hey, you got a pencil I can borrow?" She said,
"Sure, make sure you give it back."
"I can't make any promises," I replied flirtatiously. She said,
"Well, if you do, I'll hold you to it."
Equally flirtatiously. I was absolutely smitten by this girl. For the first time in my life, it appeared that a girl liked me as much as I liked her. Not only that, she was easily the prettiest girl that had ever taken interest in me. I almost couldn't believe my luck. Looking back, I realized that she was probably around a 7, but my inexperience at the time probably had her rated at about a 9. So I aced the quiz, and when Amy asked for her pencil back, I said, "Nobody uses this but me. Got it?"
"Got it,"
she says. I remember getting an adrenaline rush when she said this to me because she looked me right in the eye when she said it. And this wasn't just the type of look that said she was just acknowledging me. She looked at me like she liked me. A lot. So she says,
"From now on, we are going to call this the magic pencil, and I won't let anyone use it except for you."
So I said,
"Good girl."
Then she blushed, smiled, then whipped her head around. I honestly felt like I was back in high school. I hadn't felt this way since I was a teenager. It's hard to describe, but it was intoxicating. Well, as predicted, Amy and I dove headfirst into a serious relationship. Things moved very quickly, but neither one of us seemed to think it was fast enough. Hell, we told each other "I love you" less than a week later. We spent every waking moment together. And I mean that in the most literal sense. We were together all day and every single night. We would study during the evening, cook together, watch movies, we'd fall asleep on the couch together, and when we were in bed, we'd hold hands until we fell asleep. I mean, we did all that sappy stuff people do when they are stupidly in love. We even bought matching charms to wear around our necks. Mine was the letter A for Amy, and hers was the letter D for Donovan. I mean, we were inseparable. Amy also took great care of me. She would have my coffee waiting for me if I was running late to class. She would take notes for me if I had a migraine and wasn't feeling so hot. I mean, she moved heaven and earth to make sure I was okay. I remember this one time. I had mentioned to her offhandedly that I had forgotten to bring my lunch. I didn't really think anything of it because I figured I'd just eat a late lunch after school. Well, halfway through my legal research class, I get a text from Amy to come downstairs. And when I got there, she had a Whopper and Coke waiting for me and would not let me go back to class until I ate. I mean, I was absolutely enchanted by this girl. I had never dated a girl this pretty, who treated me this well, who loved me this much. I was head over heels for her. So near the end of the spring semester, Amy and I took a trip to the beach for her 20th birthday, and it was one of the most memorable weekends of my life. It was the weekend that we started entertaining thoughts of marriage and children. We were going to have 2 boys and 2 girls, and they all had names. We were going to live in San Diego, California, buy a house on the beach, and live out our days raising our children and being in love. My birthday was just a few months later, and when I opened my laptop to get all the birthday love from my Facebook friends, I noticed that my account wasn't the one on the screen. It was Amy's. And like every red-blooded male, I decided to do some snooping around, and what I saw made me absolutely sick to my stomach. It made me wish I'd never looked. Before I tell you how that fateful day changed everything, make sure you like, subscribe, and share this video with anyone who calls himself a man. I would also like to remind you that if you want access to tens of thousands of hours of exclusive content not found anywhere, go to patreon.com/Donovan Sharpe. There you will get access to audio and video versions of just about every episode I have ever done from the very beginning. You will also get access to my weekly Zoom calls where I do consultations, coaching, and give advice. Join our community of over 1,500 men who strive to dominate life at patreon.com/Donovan Sharpe. Link in description. Okay, let's go back to my 32nd birthday, shall we? So I took screen grabs of what I saw, put it on a flash drive, and drove over to Amy's place. I sat directly in front of her and said as carefully as I could, "Amy, you know I love you, but I'm going to ask you something and you are going to tell me the truth." She looked at me in stunned silence and slowly nodded. I gathered my thoughts and said, "Have you cheated on me?" Now, I expected her to completely deny everything. In fact, that's what I wanted her to do. Whatever crazy explanation she was going to give me, I was going to totally believe it and blindly put what I saw on Facebook behind me. But that's not what happened. After what seemed like an eternity, Amy said,
Honestly, yes.
Guys, I cannot describe to you the gravity of the shock and pain I felt at that very moment. To this day, I have never felt that kind of emotional pain. I still get a slight pang in my stomach just talking about it right now. After her revelation, I cried my eyes out, in front of her no less. And of course, so does she. She reached out to me to tell me she was sorry, but I pulled away and told her not to touch me. I got up, ran into the bathroom, and puked my guts out. Then I cried some more. I probably puked 1 or 2 more times, I don't remember, but it was all a blur. When I finally emerged from the bathroom, I yanked off my necklace with the letter A charm and threw it on her couch. Amy cried and pleaded with me not to leave, but I just couldn't deal with what I had just heard. That day at work, I could barely focus. My boss seemed to know something was up because he kept his distance and didn't really ask me anything. But all day long, Amy was calling and texting nonstop telling me she was sorry, that she'd never do it again, that she loved me, that it was a mistake, and that she wanted to make it up to me, all of the rest of that. It was extremely difficult not to respond because even though I was extremely hurt, I still loved her very much. Those feelings don't just disappear when you learn you've been wronged by someone you love. This is why I always try to be reasonable with men who reach out to me with revelations of infidelity in their relationships. It's easy for someone who is detached from the situation to say, "Just leave her, bro." But when I get that email or that message asking me how to deal with a cheating girlfriend or wife, I always think back to the very moment where Amy told me she cheated. This isn't to say that I don't advise them that that is not the relationship they should be in, but I'm a lot more empathetic in terms of the tone I take when advising someone how to pick up the pieces after discovering their significant other has been unfaithful. Anyway, towards the end of my shift, I finally cracked and called her. As expected, Amy was in tears. She apologized profusely, said she wanted to get married and be my wife, and said she had a surprise for me when she got off work. I took the bait. She came over later that night and brought me a cupcake with a birthday candle in it and gave me a card and a really nice watch I wanted. But the birthday surprises weren't over. Amy turns around, lifts up her shirt, and unveils a tattoo of my name emblazoned in fresh red and black ink on the small of her back. I was back in her clutches. Unfortunately, the damage had been done. Our relationship was never the same after that and was a far cry from what it ever was during that magical spring of 2009. I was always checking up on her, asking her who she was calling or texting, basically all the behaviors I now teach men not to engage in. As you can probably imagine, that got old with Amy very quickly. We got into some pretty crazy knockdown, drag-out shouting matches, and they happened on a regular basis. It seemed like every other day we were screaming at each other for some reason or another. I found out that she had been cheating on me throughout our relationship and that she had been doing a very bad substance that started with the letter H all summer long. I mean, this was a bad situation. But despite all of that, I was still hopelessly in love with her. And even though things were terrible between us, I still held out hope that we could get through it and recapture the magic we had back in the spring. As if all this weren't bad enough, just over a month after my birthday, her ex-boyfriend was due to get out of prison. And you won't believe what happens next. Amy woke up feeling nauseous and puked her guts out after breakfast. And if you're thinking you might know why this is, I can assure you that you are 100% right. So last week, I told you guys about my relationship with Amy and how it started. I told you guys that we met in paralegal class, hooked up, and got into a relationship that became very serious very quickly. I told you about how magical the spring of 2009 was and how we were the happiest couple ever. I also told you about the revelation of Amy's infidelity and about how it absolutely destroyed me. Well, today, I'm going to give you guys the conclusion of this torrid whirlwind romance and how it ended up sending me to the unlikeliest of destinations which would change my life forever. Now, I know you guys want to hear about Amy's ex getting out of prison, but I need to first fill you in on why he was there, how he got there, and where he fits into a story that's so crazy one couldn't possibly make this up. So after I found out Amy had been cheating on me our entire relationship, my life began a downward spiral that very nearly could have ended my life. The fall and winter of 2009, I became completely unraveled. I fell into a deep depression, dropped out of paralegal school, developed a Coca-Cola habit, was taking illegal painkillers by the handful. I mean, it was bad. I lost my job and my car because it broke down and I didn't have the money to fix it. To make matters worse, my roommate kicked me out because I couldn't pay the rent. Having no place to go, I ended up living with a couple of Amy's drugged out friends. They were a couple who were both in their 30s and both on probation for felony possession. And as you can imagine, the party favors ran rampant in this household. That's part of the reason I developed the party favor habit. The other reason is because Amy was an experienced user herself, and this was even before I met her. So let's rewind about 6 months before I lost everything and to a particular day when I had a really bad migraine headache in class. So we're sitting in Civil Lit and Amy noticed that there was clearly something wrong with me. She had a look of great concern on her face because she had never seen me like this. I was usually pretty talkative in class, but on this day I was as silent as a church mouse and had my head in my hands to shield my eyes from the light, because when you have a migraine, bright lights will make it much worse. Headache, I said to her very slowly to keep from saying too much as it would make this debilitating migraine even worse. Amy reaches into her purse and pulls out a large white pill.
Take this,
she said. What's this? I asked.
It's a Vicodin,
she replied.
Take this and your headache will go away. I promise you.
Now, the only time I can ever remember taking a painkiller that had to be prescribed by a doctor was after I had one of my wisdom teeth removed. But what I did remember was how effective they were. But let's take a moment and think about this, guys. This 19-year-old girl was young, nubile, and appeared to be in perfect health, which was par for the course for most females her age. But never once did I think to myself, what's a 19-year-old doing with Vicodin in her purse? All I knew is that I wanted my headache to be gone. So I completely dismissed the fact that Amy was carrying around a bag full of Schedule II party favors. Well, when we fast forward to the fall, what happened in class explained why she had been using the H-word party favor all summer long. You see, Amy had scores of red flags that I had been completely blind to simply because she was pretty and was paying attention to me. Amy's upbringing is the quintessential example of a girl with daddy issues. Her mother gave birth to her at 15 years old, and her father left soon after. He'd come back into Amy's mother's life from time to time, but he spent most of his daughter's life in and out of prison. He was physically Ivisuba spelled backwards, had a drinking problem, and couldn't stay out of trouble with the law. Eventually, he disappeared just after Amy's 8th birthday and was never found. Amy's mother was stricken with grief because she feared the worst, and because of this, she started drinking heavily, lost her job, her car, her trailer home, leaving her and her young daughter homeless. Over the next couple of years, they bounced from house to house living with family members and friends. But Amy's mother's proclivities to commingle with men who had substance abuse problems and criminal records got them evicted on more than one occasion. Eventually, they were taken in by a woman who is a longtime friend of Amy's grandmother, who had a 28-year-old son by the name of Ben. Ben immediately took on the surrogate father role and looked after Amy. He helped her with her homework, made sure she got to school on time, and took good care of her in the absence of her father. So for the next 3 years, this patchwork family appeared to be making it work. Amy's mother checked herself into rehab and finally got clean, Amy's grades started to improve, and Ben just landed a great job at a company that had a government contract. Everything seemed perfect until one morning, Amy woke up feeling nauseous and puked her guts out after breakfast. And if you're thinking you might know why this is, I can assure you that you are 100% right. But before I tell you about that crazy situation, let me remind you to like, comment, and share this video with anyone with a Y chromosome. I would also like to remind you that I will be breaking down the most popular dating show, The Bachelor, every Monday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on SharpStream. SharpStream is my own private streaming platform where I can speak freely without the concern of getting deplatformed. SharpStream is available to all patrons $5 and up. So if you'd like to watch me break down this historic season of The Bachelor, which features a black man for the very first time, go to patreon.com/Donovan Sharpe. Link in description. Okay, let's get back to my story. So Amy wakes up one morning and pukes her guts out. Now she has no idea why, but her mother most certainly did. And sure enough, Amy found out that she was 3 months pregnant. Even worse, Ben was the father. As you can imagine, Ben was arrested soon after, but what shocked everyone was that Amy was absolutely devastated. She had fallen in love with Ben. Now, the laws currently on the books dealing with this particular situation, which I'm not saying out loud for obvious reasons, requires a mandatory 25-year sentence. But because Amy's testimony somehow convinced the jury that the situation was not what it appeared to be, he was only sentenced to 6 years. His release date, September 16th, 2009, exactly 45 days after my 32nd birthday, which happened to be the day I found out Amy had been unfaithful. Which brings me to the end point I left off last week. The day that Ben was supposed to be released, I broke up with Amy. She was crushed, but at the time, I was resolute. I was still reeling from all that I had discovered about her, and I knew that there was no way I could handle Ben being around and what that situation had the potential to do. Amy cried and pleaded and begged me to reconsider. She assured me that she was no longer in love with Ben and that she loved me. I wanted to believe her, but I had seen and heard enough to realize she didn't know who she loved, if anyone at all. So I went home and tried to move on with my life, but I failed miserably. I tried to sleep, but I just couldn't. I tossed and turned all night long because I just couldn't get Amy out of my head. The thought that she might be hooking up with Ben at that very moment was just too much to bear. So the next morning, I called up a friend of mine, somehow talked him into letting me borrow $800, and went to the jewelry store to buy Amy an engagement ring. As soon as I bought it, I called Amy and told her to meet me at the gas station we used to go to in an hour. And right on time, she pulls up with a couple of friends of hers. She gets out of the car. I get down on one knee and asked her to marry me. True story, guys. I'm telling you, you cannot make this stuff up. I borrowed money from a friend I knew I would never pay back to buy a ring for a woman I knew I would probably never marry, and asked her to marry me. To my great relief at the time, she accepted. Her friends swooned with delight at their newly engaged friend who is now a bride-to-be. Well, the next couple of months were quite literally the worst 2 months of my life. As you probably have already guessed, Amy eventually started sleeping with Ben, and things couldn't be worse. When she got pissed off at me, she would go and sleep with Ben. When she was mad at him, she would come back to me. This love triangle continued until one night she was arrested for possession. Remember the party favor couple I talked about earlier that I would eventually end up living with? Well, they were the ones that ratted her out. I didn't know she was in jail until I got off work. Her bond, $13,000, which meant it would cost $1,300 to get her out. And between me, her mother, and Ben, we didn't have nearly enough to get her out. So once again, I pulled a rabbit out of my hat and managed to borrow $1,300 from another roommate of mine and got her out. Amy thanked me profusely and swore up and down that she was mine forever. Until, of course, she started sleeping with Ben again. The devastation and heartbreak of this back-and-forth love triangle eventually took its toll. As I explained earlier, I neglected everything: my job, school, work, and eventually lost everything and ended up having to live with the very people who called the cops on Amy. And even then, the back-and-forth love triangle was still in full force until Thanksgiving night, when Amy called me to tell me that her and Ben were now engaged to be married. Although I knew this day would eventually come, I was still devastated. I was broke, homeless, drinking every day, doing party favors, Schedule II stuff, and now I didn't have Amy. This, gentleman, was rock bottom. But believe it or not, it actually got worse. So on the morning of New Year's Day in 2010, I was in an alcohol and party favor-induced haze when we hear a knock at the door. When one of my roommates answered, there was a short, bald Jamaican man standing there. I had no idea who he was, but they most certainly did. The man walks in the door, points directly at me, and says in a thick Jamaican accent,
"You don't live here, and if you are not out of here by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, the sheriff is going to come and put you out."
Having finally exhausted every resource I had access to, I called my brother and told him about my situation. He bought me a bus ticket to Atlanta, Georgia, where my mother and brother were living, sent $10 for me to eat on, and that was the last time I was ever a resident in the state of North Carolina. I wasn't really fond of living in Atlanta, having lived there before, and my second stint proved to be equally as disappointing. I knew I didn't want to stay in the ATL, but I had no idea where I wanted to go. I thought about Florida, maybe New York, but I was clueless about where to start the next chapter of my life. Well, a longtime friend I knew back when I was in college in North Carolina lived out in Vegas and had been trying to convince me to move out there for a few weeks. I'd never really considered living there because I didn't really think it was my kind of city. I mean, what could I possibly do in a city like Vegas? So one Saturday night, out of curiosity, I went to southwest.com to see how much a one-way ticket out there would be. I was in complete shock when I saw that the ticket was just $84. I sat there and stared at the screen thinking to myself, am I really about to do this? Am I really about to move all the way out to the West Coast? A few seconds later, I bought the ticket, not having any idea how this would turn out. And on July 10th of 2010, I landed in Las Vegas, Nevada, not realizing at the time that my life would be forever changed. When I think back to the terrible fall and winter that completely destroyed my life, I realize just how fortunate I was not to have been swallowed up by that armpit of a county in rural North Carolina. I could have been arrested because of the activity in the house I was living in. I could have gotten Amy pregnant. I mean, there were so many times where this situation could have gone completely sideways and severely and permanently wrecked my life. But only by the grace of whatever forces out there kept me from falling into this black hole was I able to escape that situation with my freedom and my life. People always wonder why and how I can speak with such conviction when I talk about relationships between men and women. And the reason is, I've had extensive experience. I've slept with more girls than I care to admit. I've been cheated on, cheated with. I've had pregnancy scares, love triangles. I mean, you name it, I've been through it. But the one relationship that did by far and away the most damage was the relationship I had with Amy. And to this day, I can freely admit that I have never loved anyone or anything as much as I loved her. Now, obviously, I feel much differently today. If I were to meet such a female these days, I'd have pulled a bang and bounce and I'd have been done with her inside of about 6 weeks, give or take. But the fact that I was able to emerge from that situation to not only survive, but to thrive and build what I have built today gives me a tremendous sense of pride. This is why I do what I do. This is why I tell my stories. This is why I teach men about the true nature of women. This is why I became Donovan Sharpe. Thanks for watching.